We've got the 2010 Dodge Charger 2.7 liter. We're gonna get right down to business, edit a lot of this out, make this video as short as possible. I've got my power steering out of the way and the bracket. I've got my air conditioner loose. That's so that I could do the thermostat as well with this job. I already got that done. I got a video on that. All right, tensioner pulley. Take the belt off. And that's 16 millimeter on the tensioner pulley. We got the idler pulley right there, 13 millimeter. Took the clamp off that hose. Hose is out of the way. Radiator fan, super simple to take out. Two 8 millimeter bolts on each side. You've got this wiring harness to get out of the way. You can unscrew the box or take the harness apart. Either way, get out of the way. The radiator fan, the cooling fan, won't just come out of the way that easily. You got to turn it because it hits this metal pipe. So give it a turn and it'll come right out easy enough. Now this is our timing cover, this diamond pentagon shape. We got plenty of room here, but we got to take that harmonic balancer off. That's a 21 millimeter. And hopefully you got a small impact to put in there. This is the stubby one. They're not that expensive at like Harbor Freight. So I'm going to zip that bolt out of the middle there. Here's the harmonic balancer. You can see it doesn't have the screw holes in it. We need a harmonic balancer puller. I'm probably going to use a 3-jaw puller on this one. Hopefully we have enough room in between it and the radiator that we can use a small 3-jaw on it to get it off. We got our timing cover all cleaned up. It's pretty nasty. Quite a bit of sludge in this motor. Let's see if we can see down here on the timing marks. Right there, there is a red sprocket, and it lines up with a little groove in the crankshaft. I don't know if you can see it, it's not real clean, but there's a groove in the crankshaft right there that it lines up with. And that lines up with an arrow on your oil pump right there. You see the arrow? They're all lined up. Now there's another single chain that's colored a different color. You're gonna want the second one. So you keep spinning it till you see that first one groove or one colored link. And that goes to this camshaft up here. And then there's a one with two grooves or two colored links. And that goes to this camshaft. So the second one goes to the crank. So right now the motor is timed. Just like that, it's in time. And this chain's pretty tight. Now we have, first thing I'm gonna do is take out the tensioner. Right down in there, you see those two bolts that cover? Look like 10 millimeters. We're gonna take those two out, and our timing chain tensioner is gonna pop out of there. Let's get that done. Here's our primary timing chain tensioner. See where the sludge buildup was? This little line is the point of replacement right here. It's actually, there's actually a measurement you could take. This tensioner looks like it was still good, but the O-ring is nowhere to be found. It rattled on startup a little bit, and this clip totally destroyed. There's our little, the back of the cap. That's where the oil goes through the back hole. This guy and our clip. I found the pieces of the clip. So this guy's gonna get replaced. No retaining clip, no O-ring. I don't know where that O-ring is. We'll try to track her down. All right, so with that tensioner out, now we have lots of slack right here. I can take this chain off the water pump. Still pretty tight right here. So we're gonna loosen up these guides, this one and this one, so we can get those water pump bolts. Now we should be throwing an entire timing kit into this. I'm gonna try to do it without taking off the valve covers. Those cams should stay still for me. If I'm careful with the chain, the chain will stay in the same grooves and it'll come back into place. Timing should be set. I'm going to be real careful. So this car is actually being traded in. It just needs to stop pouring out coolant first. And normally I would not do this for someone I didn't know. I would replace everything. I mean, we're talking intake gasket, valve cover gasket, chains, guides, everything. But this sucker's getting traded. I do not like doing this, but we'll just do the water pump. All right, we got all the bolts out of the water pump. They're right there. And that water pump is loose because I took out the bolts here and here. Loosen, the tensioners are actually barely in the way for the water pump to come straight out. Now what I've found is this chain can almost go over the water pump and get out of the way. I mean, it was just right there. But the chain starts hitting on the engine, and I didn't want to pry on the chain if we're reusing it. I've never done one of these without replacing all the timing components. This is a special situation. So, I don't want to pry on it. I'm going to take this valve cover off. So I took that intake off, that tube. I'm going to take these 4 bolts out of the throttle body. I already disconnected the wiring and the vacuum hose. So if we get this cover off, I think we could do this water pump without taking the other cover off. But we'll see. This is just a big experiment. I've done these motors before, but never this way. Having a little fun with it, messing around, seeing what I can and can't do. Let's get to it. Valve cover's coming off. Which means this throttle body's coming off so that I can pull the valve cover off. We're going to take all these coil packs out of the way. All right. Hey, we got our valve cover off pretty easy. Get your wiring out of the way. Bolts were stripped out on the coil packs. They got these little brass fittings that fit in there. So coil pack stayed on. Popped it off. Got my cam marked in several locations. So that's the 2 colored chains right there. Should be pointing pretty much straight up if it's timed right. And it won't line up with the marks anymore on the cam. It's been rotated so many times. But the crank's in position and these marks are pretty much straight up, so that's good. Timing's right. So I marked a bunch of locations so that it goes right back on the same way. And this engine's so nasty. Oh, I'll see this a lot on 2.7s. So the experiment failed. Now we're taking this cam sprocket off. We got 2 bolts here, 2 pins here. So it goes on the right way every time. So, yeah, time to loosen those 2 bolts up. All right, when you take that gear off, your cam's gonna snap back a little. That's why I marked it. See, snap back a little bit. But we're gonna make those marks line right back up. We're gonna have the colored keys line right back up where they're supposed to be on the cam gear. And our chain just fell down. The cam gear will fall down a little bit. You pull the chain over it, pull the cam gear up. And our timing tensioner fell out of there because we already unbolted it through those peak holes. Now the important thing is to keep the chain right where it's at on the passenger side of the cam. And then when we put this chain back on, we got to make sure that color is right there on the crank because the crank hasn't moved at all. But now you should be able to just pull this water pump right out, and that's the guide for the other side I loosened up. The only tricky part I see is lining up those guides on the side I don't have torn apart. I'm never going to do this again where I just changed the water pump. This is ridiculous. So it was an experiment. Had fun with it. There's our water pump. So these things leak through here. The bearings go bad, whatever. And then on here, it goes through a hole down in there, and then comes out the weep hole underneath the thermostat housing. So that coolant's not being put down in your oil pan. Of course, when you're cleaning and when you're working on this, put some rags in there. That way if you drop one of these bolts out of the water pump or something, it doesn't go in your oil pan. Alright, we're going to stick our camera down here and make sure we got all the gasket off. Looks like we can clean it a little more right here. Kind of just move the chain off to the side. Alright. So just use your phone to kind of see if you got all the gasket. It's tough to see. We're going to clean up the valve cover gasket too. Stuff some rags all around there to keep stuff from getting in. Alright, I'm going to explain what I did so far. I put the new water pump in. Sitting right here. Bolted down all the little bolts, the 10 millimeters. So that was cool. Then you get your two 13 millimeters. They're for the upper tensioners. So I fed this one in first, the tensioner. Got it started on the 13 millimeter on the water pump. And then used a small screwdriver to line up the hole with the hole in the engine. See, and then we started that bolt. Then we put the upper tensioner on this side, a lot easier with the valve cover off. The upper tensioner. That was that. Then we put the passenger side guide back in loosely with the bolt at the bottom. Now this doesn't attach to anything up top. The tensioner over here lets it spring forward. Alright, so we got all that on. The chain in there, and then pulled the chain up through here as high as we could, set the gear down in there, put the chain over it, lined it back up with my mark, chain with the mark, and that was straight up and down. But then the cam on the back here didn't line up with the gear. That's because this cam sprung to the inside clockwise, and this one went counterclockwise. So we turned that crank clockwise because this cam turned clockwise, and we can't move that cam with the valve cover still on. I turned that crank clockwise till the keyway, or the mark in the chain lined up with the mark on the chain. So this cam, we were careful with that chain that it stayed in its teeth, didn't play with that chain. This cam and the crank are timed together, but that's going to make this one off. So both of them got turned clockwise, so this one gets turned clockwise. You can see my mark on the inside is now clockwise turned the same amount as the other cam got turned according to chain length. So now that's all hooked up. And now you could take a 3/8 drive extender with that cam just sitting on there. It'll just spin around there and turn this so that the bolt holes on the back of the cam line up with this. And everything is shifted clockwise just a little bit now. Now I should be able to turn my crank because the color-coded chain link is matched up with the mark on the crankshaft sprocket. I should be able to turn it counterclockwise and set everything back in place. But to get this guide in down here, you turn this cam clockwise to get a bunch of slack down there. Then you can put that guide in, then turn this back counterclockwise, this whole cam, after you've tightened up your bolts. And then it tightens this chain down here. Now this chain is tight. We want all our slack for reassembly in this chain. So we got all our guides tight, cams tight, torqued down. Everything should be timed up in place. We just got to make sure we get all the slack to this side. Alright guys, we almost pulled it off. Almost, but not quite. I was adjusting tension to this side of the chain, and I heard the chain inside here spin over. It skipped. So that was a fun experiment. We're doing it properly now. So you take the intake plenum off there. There's your gaskets in the middle. Always replace those. Pretty straightforward. You've got these bolts right up here on top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The EGR pulls right out of here. It's sealed with an O-ring. A couple of vacuum hoses, vacuum hose. And on the side here, you got 2 little pegs. You gotta take the metal bracket off. Those are 10 millimeter on that metal bracket. And then they go down in there to a 13 millimeter. I got them taken off. And this thing will move, the EGR will come out, and then you'll get hung up on the transmission pipe here a little bit. If you get it at the right angle, it'll clear it just fine. So now we're gonna take this valve cover off. I don't think I showed the other side. We've got 10 millimeter bolts everywhere. It's all nasty in here. So we got 8 millimeter to that wire there, and then there's a 10 millimeter underneath of it. You got 10 millimeter there in the center. Then all your outside ones, all the way around. And this valve cover will just come clean up out of there for you. And I'm gonna clean that valve cover off and then get that surface cleaned up, that valve cover gasket surface. And we'll set this timing correctly. Got our valve cover off. And it turns out I didn't jump a tooth. That was just the sound of the chain tightening. I was actually dead on. So that colored mark lines up perfectly with the actual timing mark right there on that tooth. And this arrow is the timing mark, and it goes all the way across to this perfectly. So we're gonna go ahead and reset the timing. We are gonna spin these cams till the marks are straight up. We're gonna spin that crankshaft counterclockwise till the mark on the crank sprocket matches the arrow on the oil pump. We're gonna do this real nice and slow. This is interference engine, but you could spin your cams with 3/8 drive here. So we're gonna get these marks pointing straight up on the cams, and the crank, spin it clockwise to its position. Let's see if we can get a good angle on this. There's the mark on the crankshaft. It's a groove, and it points directly at this little arrow on the oil pump. The chain, I had all the tension down here, so I was able to slide it off. Now I'm gonna line up that crankshaft mark. That's gonna be a single marked, or a single discolored keyway. The passenger side is gonna be a single one, so the first, and then it's gonna be a double one on the driver's side. So let's get the chain all lined up now. All right, we got all our marks lined up. I put that old tensioner back in there just so I could spin everything easily. It's pretty easy to take out. I'll show you how that works. So we got our timing mark right there on the off color key. Same thing over here. Our arrow is pointing right in between those 2 keys. Crankshaft is right where it should be. I showed you that earlier. And everything's looking good. Chain's looking pretty tight. But this tensioner, the retaining ring busted. The O-ring's nowhere to be found. Always replace tensioner with every one of these jobs. I mean, we didn't exactly do this one right, but it's a special scenario. Normally we change everything, you know, instead of just pulling those guides out and putting them back in. Same thing with the chain. But she is in time right now. So we're gonna put everything back together. Still gotta clean up this valve cover, or where the valve cover gasket sits. New valve covers, new plenum gasket. There's gonna be a torque sequence and spec on those valve covers and that plenum. Look it up, ask your parts store. It's usually gonna be inside out. Make sure you get that EGR in there on your plenum. But we're gonna reassemble reverse order. So that is how you set the timing. let's see here. Maybe put a dab of RTV right there on the timing gasket where the block meets the pan. Put everything back together. So I'll show you how to do that new tensioner. Put the timing cover back on. Put the harmonic balancer back on. We're gonna have to bolt our power steering back up. That's pretty easy. Bolt the AC back up. That's to do the thermostat that I got the other video on. You know, put the belt back on, tensioner, idler pulley, put these plugs back in, put our camshaft sensor back in, clip up all our coils and everything. The coils actually came out on that side. And if I forgot anything, just ask me a question. I'll get back to you real quick. I'm going to show that tensioner being activated, and that should be the end of the video. Alright, we got our new tensioner installed right there. See this guide? Still has slack. I got to activate that tensioner. Make sure your O-ring behind that cap is good. Probably want to change that sucker. So before we activate it, make sure your timing marks are good. We're right on our timing mark there, the colored key. We're good there. And we're good down below. So now we're going to activate it. And again, how I first started doing this job is not the way to do it. Ended up starting to do it properly. But I would have had it timed just fine. But that's tricky. That's something you don't want to do. Alright, so we're just going to put a bar in. And we're going to press back on this tensioner. And then release. And that little backwards motion activates the tensioner. See, now it's tight. Now I can't push it forward. After you activate that tensioner, just make sure your timing mark is still good on the crank. Then throw everything back together. Don't forget to clean right here where those seals go on the valve cover. There's another spot I cleaned. Throw everything back together, get some coolant in it, bleed it. You got little bleeder valves for the coolant there. Change the oil, make sure you change the oil. When I took the water pump off, a little bit of water went down in there. We're gonna change that. Oil and filter, get everything put together, and that'll do it. Hey guys, I just want to do a quick wrap up. Got the harmonic balancer on. I used a longer bolt in my spare bolt pile to get her started instead of tapping it with a hammer or something like that. So harmonic balancer installer tools, that's the way I did it. Got my belt set up going on. So if you need a belt routing, that's the way it goes. AC, crank, tensioner, alternator, idler, power steering, back to AC. Covers back on. Be careful with those bolts. Don't break any. They have a torque spec. Don't forget any locations. Remember that small one's up there. The Torx one's up there. Got my power steering AC back on. Got those bolts from the underneath on a couple of them. Now putting the valve cover back on. This valve cover is going to go on, then I'm going to put the intake on, then I'm going to put that valve cover on and hook up all the wiring. That's pretty simple. All right. Hope you liked the video.